everyone. Well, first of all, I want to express my thanks and appreciation to the Minister, Javier Garcia Bejos, for his invitation for me to be here. For me, it's an honor moderating this table with such outstanding personalities in the issue of the 2030 agenda. I want to thank, all of the panel members have been introduced, and I think that it's of the utmost importance the fact that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as we know, that was approved in 2015 after the development objectives of the millennium. This was approved by the United Nations Assembly with a comprehensive vision both for sustainability, both economic, social, and environmental. This provides a framework with goals, ambitious targets, and it acknowledges that development must be comprehensive in order to end with poverty and fight against inequality, building prosperous economies. An inclusive society will lead us to this new paradigm of development by means of a multidimensional process. So today, and I believe that this has been the focus of this meeting, really, is aimed at ending poverty in all its forms. This is the intent. This is the intent for the 2030 agenda that talks about universal social protection, and it's been approached with a broad coverage as far as a coverage for health services, quality education, empowerment of women, and full and productive employment, and economic and sustained growth. Well, economic sustained growth, rather. That is why, for me, it's a pleasure welcoming our panelists, our panel members, and I'm going to ask them. I'm going to ask to take the floor Ms. Paulina Terrazas, who is the head of the Special Projects Unit from the Presidential Office of the Presidential Office of the Republic. She has a political sciences and international relations graduate from ELCIDE, and she has a master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I'm going to ask a question. Paulina, what do you think that, according to what the international organizations are doing, what would be the best practices really in order to implement the 2030 agenda, in order to eliminate or remove or eradicate poverty? So I'm going to ask each one of the panel members to take 5 minutes in order to give their answers, in order for the panel to be more dynamic. Well, thanks, Assistant Minister. Well, that question is exactly the question that seems to be among the most interesting, because in some way we were asking whether mankind could reach an agreement of what to do for the future, how we imagine the future, and if that which we imagine might really be what we wish for it to be. And curiously enough, we may have some slides, because we were going to leave the rest of the slides, but we didn't agree upon what we want, but rather how we'll do so that this which we wish for is going to be different. None of this is altogether new. What is new regarding the 2030 agenda is not these 17 things. What's interesting and new and deeply transformational regarding public policy, but also development public policy for the state to pursue. It's how we think in those 17 things all together, and not think about them in an isolated manner, but in the three dimensions which it sounds so nice, social and economic and environmental. In practice, how this becomes, how these three dimensions interact, and then after that, and we know how the three dimensions interact in the case of the S1, that is poverty, which is our core subject for today. But obviously, we have to think about how poverty related to everything that is not poverty, a historical and structural change for the Mexican state, but also for the world as well. how we start to think about all the interactions amongst themselves, how it relates poverty with water, environment, with gender, with climate change. And so besides considering the historical problems of thinking about multidimensionality, well, we have efforts that we have to acknowledge that development is also multidimensional. So we start thinking about interactions, and we find with one thing which is deeply transformational and revolutionary, which is our public policy, our planning processes, and our budgeting, or our public servants, and our own training, and or as background as officials. None of these are multidisciplinary. So each one of us is used to thinking in one of those three dimensions: the social, the economic, or the environmental. And we do, well, maybe some very innovative things we might think about too. But it's difficult for us to think about these three dimensions. And that's where, finally, we have to consider change. Why? Well, besides that, we're going through a historical moment, not only for the world, but specifically for the case of Mexico, halfway about bringing an administration to the close and starting another one with a historical window for opportunity. Why? Because at the end of the day, the next 6 months, we're going to know what's going to happen in the next 6 years. There's not only sustainable development in the revision and the thinking over about public policies and programs, but also the evidence at the center of all the public policy decisions. Because we have to rethink not only what we're going to do, so that that when we have done by sectors or in one dimension, that will become three-dimensional, but we have to think about how well planned, budget, evaluate, measure in a different way. And this challenge has a lot to do with the best practices for implementation, which is a $1 million question. There are certain tips, for example, starting from international organizations that some of the countries have been trying to follow. And this conversation about the hows, there are things that work better than others. And one of them is the issue of coordination, which was a part that the previous panel debated. What do we coordinate, and for where should we coordinate? We have to coordinate from a space. Well, for example, from the highest level, from the executive power, and then how do we establish those mechanisms? And there are international recommendations that say, let's talk about a national council, and let's set up a plan. If we can put out a photo of what the country should be like, then we will be capable of having a plan for a strategy. The famous this national strategy in the Mexican case is a plan of how we look today, how we might look in 2030, and what we have to do. And then what we have to do goes through the filter of what we have done. And many times it doesn't. Many times what do we have to do? Maybe we had the regulatory framework and the budget framework, we could do it, but we haven't been able to do. But if we don't think about what we have done, we won't think about what we'll have to do, because we have to think in a deeper terms. We have to integrate sustainable development, have to integrate all the processes, the budgeting, the evaluation, and such. That may be useful if we for this to go from the United Nations, which is something abstract, to go into our everyday reality, what we do on the street, in the as common citizens. So the challenge is in terms of the depth and the complexity, but besides this, how we rethink that everything is much more than just the sum of the parts. Thanks very much, Paulina. And now I'm going to introduce our friend Antonio Molpeceres, who's a resident coordinator of the National United Nations System and a representative from Mexico. He's an economist from Yale University, Montreal, Canada, and Master in Economic Sciences from Montreal University. And we would ask him the question. You know the question, or should I repeat it? Yeah, from the perspective, in your case, of international organizations, Antonio, which do you consider would be the best practices in order for the implementation of the 2030 agenda in order to remove poverty, to eliminate poverty? Thanks. I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this very important event, and the assistant minister that I know has been several years wanting to hold a seminar of this sort, and that finally he did it. I think that it's something that we have to acknowledge this, and also GIZ, I want to thank. I will start by saying that I fully agree with everything that Paulina has said. Everything she has said, I fully agree. So that for me, it's kind of difficult to give it an added value to what she has said. Well, first of all, well, when we talk about good practices in order to reduce or eliminate poverty in the context of the 2030 agenda, we have gone barely 2 years. Well, this was approved in 2015, and so then saying, well, this has worked, and during the last 2 years, I think it's, in my opinion, it would be something that's premature. But what I think is important, what I've learned here in Mexico is the emphasis on the fact that people should know this agenda. They should be familiar. They should be acquainted that there's a commitment from the state in order for compliance with this goal. There's a commitment from the state, from the governments, to eliminate extreme poverty from here until the year 2030, and that there's the possibility for us to achieve it. I'm an optimist. I think that by the year 2030 we can eliminate extreme poverty that many people are going through today. So I think that if to start with, there's a national awareness in Mexico and in all the countries that there's a state commitment in order to meet these objectives, these 169 goals and such. I think that this is an important step, because then this implies a political obligation, a set of behaviors from decision makers, and it also implies that whatever policies they have will incorporate this 2030 agenda into their development policy, their general development policy. This is a first step, a general awareness, but also from the public at large. Yesterday I was highly privileged to make a presentation of the 2030 agenda before 1,250 small businessmen. Many of them didn't know about it. I go to the universities and tell them about this. There's a government commitment, there's a state commitment, and you have to compel those that the decision makers to meet this agenda. So everything that Paulina has said, for us it's very important to be able to locate, to define all the actions, be very specific in the measures undertaken in order to eliminate poverty. It's something holistic. We can't talk just about one objective. We have to talk about objectives number 2, 3, 4, and 5. And objective number 10, which is reduce inequalities, which is essential. All of them are incorporated. All of them are part of this. The education, all of that's fine. But if we don't situate and define the actions where they should go, where they should be placed, we won't meet our goals. And in order to situate them and define them, it's a must, for the governments and the provinces and the states to incorporate these agenda into their development plans. This is essential. In the case of Mexico, for those in the room that don't know it, already all the states have a board, a sort of board or a council for the 2030 agenda. So working locally with the municipalities, with the states or provinces, that's essential. And I think that's a very good practice in order to answer your question. Thanks very much, Antonio. I think it's extremely critical what you have just said, because I remember when I was in the health ministry, we worked on the objectives of the Millennium Objectives, and we thought that there was a long time still, and when only 2 years were still came, how we did in order to speed up the pace and decrease the mortality among mothers, and this requires an effort from the beginning, as you've well said. It's only 2 years, but I think that time goes by quickly. And I think that Mexico has played a great role in the sense that at the presidential level, we have coordinated together with this council, which is going to lead us to this coordination in a more systematic way, so that it may get where it has to, which is the municipalities at the local level, where these actions should reach. Now, if I'm allowed, Andi Dulung which was a general director for poverty relief from the Ministry of Social Issues in Indonesia. By the way, I want to express my condolences for what happened on account of the earthquake and the tsunami that took place. I would ask him to tell us, please, Andi, what strategies and/or programs have been implemented successfully in each region that may contribute to the reduction of extreme poverty in a sustained manner, in a sustainable manner. Gracias. Antes de esto, deseo expresar mi...
Thank you very much to JZ and also government of Mexico, especially Sodasol, Javier. Thank you very much. I think we learned a lot here, and then especially as 2 days ago, we went to one of the places that's public kitchen, right? That one is very, very good. And then my minister also told me that we try to implement it in Indonesia next time. Currently there is such like that, but small scale by private, and then maybe what taken by the government. I think we see the example very good. Yes, thank you very much for that. Talking about the strategy and what to implement, actually, we are happy to introduce what we have done in Indonesia. That we see the trend of poverty is decreasing steadily since Indonesia implementing CCT program, we call it Program Keluarga Harapan in 2006-07. Both poverty rate and number of poor people were dropped until 2013. However, during 2013 to 2015, the poverty rate remained relatively stagnant. The reason are the beneficiaries of PKH were stagnant, and the targeting also of the complementary program was, we can say, unsuccessful at that time because beneficiary data still left behind. However, in September 2017, the rate of extreme poverty has fallen rapidly, and in 2018 become 1 digit, 9.82%. This is the first time we reach this figure for poverty in Indonesia. Right? This, I think, 2/3 from 2007 value. One the most supporting this because of implementation of the complementary programs. So implementation of complementary program, PKH or CCT, scholarship for poor, and non-cash food assistance programs, we call it BPNT. This claim is supported by Central Bureau of Statistics that PKH and BPMT is the main contribution for reducing poverty rate in Indonesia. So, as you know, according to the consumption statistic, the poor people spend 70% for food. And among them, the first consumption is rice, and the second is cigar. The third is egg. So the cigar became number 2 actually. But, so that's our program now. We changed the rice become cash transfer, but have to buy 2 things which they need, rice and egg, not cigar, of course. We can conclude that the implementation for CCT and food stamp BPNT shown of positive impact for reducing poverty in Indonesia. After the implementation of both programs, poverty rate decreased steadily. This is supported by many data which we have done in the field. This trend is 10.86 in 2016, and the targeted decline until 2018 in 1 digit. So the reason is that's the thing program complementary and then become like sharp to decrease in the poverty in Indonesia. Thank you, Madam.
Muchas gracias, Andy. Creo que nos ha dado
I believe that you've given us a picture, you've given us an idea of how you have decreased poverty in your country, a country that's more complicated due to so many islands. It must be much more difficult. And how in these 2 years from 2017 until now, you have decreased together with the other public food assistance programs. I hope that the cigarette is not the second product that you consume, because besides that is quite harmful for health. Okay, thanks very much. Now I'm going to ask Lefhoko, Kesamang, who is the higher official for welfare in the African Union, who was coordinator of clinical services and social work in public health for the government of Botswana, who is going to give us his opinion also. I would ask him also what his opinion is, according to international organizations, what would be the best practices in order to implement, or for the implementation of the 2030 agenda regarding the eradication or the elimination of poverty.
I'm going to speak from a continental and a global view of how we work around the implementation of Agenda 2030. And the African Union is a unique organization, even internationally, that is composed of the whole continent. The membership is the whole continent. And of course, it was born out of really difficult experiences and history. That's why we have got this kind of an organization. Now, the African Union has got an observer status to the UN. We are not a member, maybe like the EU. That's what I'm told, that the EU have got even ratification privileges. We opted out of that. It's only our member states who are members directly. So the African Union in 2013 celebrated its 50 years of its existence. And through that commemoration, it came up with what we call the African Union Agenda 2063, which was adopted by the heads of state in 2013, January. And I'm proud to say that, of course, I mean, the Agenda 2063 had a very positive impact in the development of the Agenda 2030. So the cap or the common position, African position, was used to develop Agenda 2030. Therefore, the African member states, by implementing the African Union Agenda 2063, they are actually implementing the UN Agenda 2030. In that way, the agenda of the African Union contains very explicitly an aspiration on eradicating poverty. That is aspiration number 1. And it states very clearly on what to do to eradicate poverty. Let me just read it before I conclude on this first question. It says here, a prosperous Africa based on the inclusive growth and sustainable development. And through that, it talks about ending hunger, achieving food security, and improving nutrition, as well as achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls, and to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy, and promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, and provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Having said this, now what the African Union is saying is that to eradicate poverty in Africa, we have to come up with this agenda, which is running from 2013 to 2063. And in that, you develop policies and treaties and as well as programs and projects in order to now implement this aspiration. Therefore, this aspiration, of course, is related to the zero hunger, is related to agenda equality, affordable clean and energy for all, and peace and justice, and strong institutions that you will find in the Agenda 2030. Therefore, the African Union, through its member states, implement Agenda 2030 and in eradicating poverty through by implementing their own agenda, which they adopted in 2015 as well. Now, in a nutshell, we develop policies which I'm going to elaborate on later, and we develop treaties. These treaties and policies, they are now used through domestication by member states to deal with the issue of eradication of poverty. I will elaborate that later. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Very much, Lefhoko, for this participation, where you explain to us the president of the agenda of the African Union agenda, with the eradication of poverty and the nutrition, the improvement of food, and so on, and how this can be a president, or how it was a president for the 2030 agenda, which is quite interesting. Thanks very much. And now we would give the floor to Christina Dankmeyer. She's an advisor of the Social Protection Initiative from the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ. She is a European Studies major from the Passau University and master in public policies from the Verdi School of Governance, both schools in Germany. And Christina, I would also ask you the question about what your opinion is by reason of being an international organization, about which are the best practices to eradicate poverty or for the 2030 agenda. Muchísimas gracias por las bondadosas palabras y como introducción. O sea, ya en muchos puntos ya se han mencionado. Nada más voy a tratar de complementar esta pregunta desde la perspectiva de la cooperación alemana para el desarrollo, para el Ministerio para el Desarrollo Económico y el Desarrollo. Trataré de limitarme a 3 puntos.
Crucial to successfully implement the Agenda 2030 in partner countries. The first one, if we're serious about the central pledge of member states to leave no one behind as part of the Agenda 2030, then and also to reach SDG number 1, we need to focus our efforts on protecting all people against the different risks that we face, all of us face, by building and strengthening systems that can identify and reach them whenever they're exposed to risks, and also to adapt to shocks and potential shocks to the system quickly. To this end, international organizations and also development partners, including German Development Corporation, are now advocating for universal social protection, which is something that I mentioned to you, to some of you on Monday during our workshop, through the Universal Social Protection Initiative, USP 2030. That is the central mechanism now to promote this goal of universal social protection. And we consider universal coverage a best practice, if you will. Because, I mean, gradually working towards this goal is something that every country should strive for, and be it through universal programs, so the universality of instruments, or also through complementary targeted programs that also achieve universality of coverage. So this is my first point. Secondly, when we think of social protection in the SDGs, we think of Goal 1 and we think of Target 1.3, but as the two of you, Paulina specifically mentioned before, we tend to think in sectors, but the Agenda 2030 is actually of an interlinked nature. So the different SDGs are supposed to work together, and we're supposed to find integrated approaches to achieve those goals together. And this has concrete implementations also at country level, at operational level. And to be honest, I think isolated projects and programs should be a thing of the past. I mean, that is something that we should try and avoid, and we should strive towards integrated approaches. We know that everybody, every one of us knows that here from implementation, is that everyone supports coordination, but nobody likes to be coordinated. Let's be honest. But the nature of the Agenda 2030 requires systems that link and harmonize programs to ensure that they complement each other. And although I'm usually hesitant to talk about best practices, we know what works at operational level. We know that, I mean, we heard today, and also over the past couple of days, we heard about universal registries. We heard that you don't just need a common beneficiary registry, but you also need a comprehensive social registry that links to civil registration, so registration of births and deaths. And actually supports integrated information management. That's a key prerequisite of a universal system. And also beyond standardizing information systems, we also need to standardize criteria, benefit values, and also service delivery. And we have very good projections on which we can base these efforts. We know where extreme poverty will be found in the future. I mean, we heard about sub-Saharan Africa the other day. We also know that by 2030, about 50% of the extreme poor will live in fragile contexts. We know that climate-related shocks are going to increase in intensity and severity and frequency as well. And we know that certain populations are going to be more vulnerable to these shocks than others. And we also know that our accomplishments in terms of actually reducing poverty over the past 2 decades could be reversed through these climate-related effects. Some say even by up to 40%. And we therefore need to move from reactive approaches to proactive ones. And that is my third point today. In terms of climate-related risks, this means that we actually need to move beyond just adaptation. We need to integrate mitigation also in social protection programs and systems. And we need to start with adaptive measures earlier. So one example that we discussed this week was forecast-based financing, which is something that highlights this quite well. That you actually need to provide enough money before a shock happens. So either as part of a social protection program that already exists, or as a top-up to that program, so that people can actually prepare for a shock. And so that is just one part of the coin. So on the one hand, you need to include social protection systems in contingency planning as well, but vice versa then designing risk-informed social protection systems. So these are my 3 points. So the first one is the goal and the objective of universal social protection, so that's the what. The second point then is systemic implementation, so the how, working with integrated information management. And then the third one is this anticipatory support, so the when, to avoid reverse effects and slow response to shocks. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Cristina. Creo que has tocado un punto focal muy importante, que es la coordinación y cómo realmente se puede hacer la coordinación de los diferentes sectores, porque al final del día pues necesitamos tener todos los aspectos, no solo para disminuir la pobreza, contar con servicios de salud, con una educación de calidad, y siempre tiene que haber un liderazgo. Yo aquí quisiera comentar que Cedesol ha hecho una estrategia importante de la Estrategia Nacional de Inclusión, en donde está coordinando realmente los esfuerzos, por un lado de la alimentación, han planteado el ejemplo de los comedores comunitarios, que ha sido un trabajo del subsecretario García Abejos importantísimo. Pero esa vinculación, esa coordinación que a las mismas personas que requieren
people that has been needing this type of food, and to have also and to provide the health protection and the coverage as well, providing quality education through scholarship is all an inclusion strategy that is focalized to the low income, low resources people. So they are well addressed. There is a register that is complete with all these beneficiaries that is going to be interlinked with the different institutions. And I think it's very important, and we always need to see that type of leadership. Also, what you're saying about the environment, I think we still need to work more in that aspect. And I mean all the countries. Now, if you allow me, let's have a second round of questions, and then if we still have some time, maybe we could answer some questions from you, from the attendees, if there is any comment or question. So Paulina, what are the affirmative actions need to be taken in the region in order to have a more joint agenda for meeting the different objectives of sustainable development, but focus on the first one, that is the social protection and eradication of poverty? We were thinking different types of for being part of this reply or answer, and at the end we think we have 5. The first thing is the implementation and poverty question are very similar. Is how to start doing what we need to do in a multidimensional way, and how do we know that we are doing is working. So part of the challenge is in the 2030 agenda is something that we haven't done before. So obviously, we can see the recommendations. We have shared the different experiences, but it's not clear what is if we did if what we're doing is really the best that we could do, or with something. So this is quite a rich discussion, and this is something that we had in Sede Sol, and maybe we agree with Doctor that this is a historical moment. Just try to change poverty into a multidimensional measurement of this poverty in different multidimensional actions, to rethink how social policies should do that. This is also a recurrent discussion, and thank you to the GIZ support to think in the different sectors and to know if this is going on in all the countries, and that the answer is yes. So we are trying to take different points. So where do we have these limits of social policies, and how to link it with the economic things? Of course, we need to change multidimensional from the measured into practice. Latin America and the Caribbean, not just to be in this region, but also because we know that we have 10 countries that are already measuring and are in the middle of the process to do it in the multidimensional. And the challenge is that once we have done that, what can do afterwards, and what to do to meet all the different shortages or inefficiencies, and to coordinate of what Christina is saying, how to really coordinate. How do we do it in practice if we just in this position and we're trying to move forward with different segmentation stories and with budget problems? The other thing is, of course, is how to move from condition transfers to create all these local capacities, how to turn all these productive capacities, and how to do it just by thinking in the environment. There's no doubt that there is an issue, and in talking about affirmative actions, and not to leave anybody behind, what it should be translated in the practice is to visibilize all these different gaps. So not only how in doing in poverty, but within poverty, each of the populations or communities, and how these pathways are being crossed, because it's not the same thing to talk about the media of poverty, the rural poverty, and other types of poverty. So how to do it to generate all these public policies for second opportunities, and also related to prevent those risks. The other thing, the common one, is while we do all of things with poverty, we're also fighting the evidence as part of the public policies. We have thought that the evidence should be the center of it. Of course, we need to increase the impact assessment and use them. In terms of social development, this is where we have gotten the biggest impact, or at least the measurements, according to the experience, and Prospera is just one example of that, how they are going to be displayed. But at the end, if we just make all these history, or if we gather all the stories, we still have some of the problems with social actions. But with 6,000 actions, is there any sense? Are they going to be measured or coordinated? If what is going to work, and which one of them are the priority, and how to rethink some of those? So how to make this, or to build this framework where everything could happen for those who have been more complex. So we should stop thinking in social aspects. So the big challenge is not to have all these public policies of some isolated cross-section examples. And one example comes to my mind, because it's not for the social development, but it goes through that. And this is a productive system that is sustainable and with the biodiversity. How to do it, all the local capabilities, and to sum all of the above. All the local capabilities could be transformed and to have, in order to have enough income, but also to have the access to the different services to be out of poverty, and at the same how to transform the reality from the communities and how those communities are going to be linked to the environment, because at the end that's the purpose. We are not talking about in an isolated way. If we know that half of the biodiversity in Mexico are in these productive centers or productive areas, is not talking about this biodiversity in an isolated way. It's in the middle of the communities where they are producing, so we need to rethink productivity so we can have the different alternatives so those families can live better and to be protecting the environment. If you ask ourselves with what is our letter to Santa Claus, we can see that we need to have all this affirmative, and we need to rethink all these public policies as well as the development in the economic policies until we create a whole puzzle. And then the question it will be how to make all this at the different sections and cross-section. I think the social policies could be also an example in that way, because we have gotten the historic work of turning into a more coordinated and a broadened area, but also the risk is there of getting it into a more scattered actions. What is going on right now? I don't know if that is the answer, but first of all, we need to be to notice what are the gaps, and then to know what is working, and with evidence on hands to know exactly what is not working, just to leave it behind, or how to restructure it. And once that has already worked and had made some progress historically, as we have at this moment, this should be and to keep working. Microphone is not working. Thank you, Paulina. I think we are confirming the need of that coordination, and that coordination should reach all programs or everything that is best known. So that's why I reiterate the coordination that is being done to important population groups in terms of poverty through this strategy. We also need this national strategy for social inclusion, where we also need the coordination not only at the state level but also at the municipality level, as well as the different actors that are related to these programs, and especially to reach the people and not being scattering out some programs that at the state level or the municipal level are not working properly. And sometimes this is just a misuse of resources. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Antonio if he can tell us from his experience what would be the factors or determining factors for the eradication of poverty beyond the income in the region. Microphone is not working. I'm going to give you two examples that have a huge impact for reducing poverty. Three, in fact, but that are not related to income, but they're very linked to income. One of us is that is quite proven that if you put cement to the floor of a house, by just adding the cement to the house, the impact for reducing poverty of that family is huge, more than any other social program from the government. Just the cement, of course, it has the implication in the health of the children and in the growth of the children. So it's there already. And in Mexico, there are still some houses with no cement on their floor. But that's one thing. Another one, the second, in Africa. The nets above the beds to prevent malaria. The impact of a family that has all these nets to prevent malaria or paludism is huge. We can see the well-being of the family is great, and it's not that complicated. And I know that in the last years there have been huge efforts in that sense. And the third example would be something that you can see in the communities where there is no ATM, but just getting an ATM in a community, and 10% of these communities of a certain size of in Mexico, they don't have ATMs, so they don't have access to this money. Very easy tasks to do. But first of all, I would like to make a distinction between getting out people from poverty and ensure that people that has been out do not go back to poverty, because are two different things with very different policies. In the first case, to getting people out of poverty, what we're observing, especially in Latin America, is that there is a point where we have these hard exclusions, these groups that could be defined by gender, by race, by ethnic group, by disabilities, where taking out of poverty is extremely difficult, and there should be very proactive policies to take them out of poverty. We have the Secretary of Oaxaca, we have it here, and I know that in Oaxaca, indigenous groups or indigenous communities is a state, or one of the states with the greatest number of groups, and for them it's a huge challenge. If you take the case of Mexico, 7.4% of the population lives in extreme poverty. And Javier, correct me if I'm saying something wrong, because I know you know those figures like the palm of your hand. The 7.4 lives in extreme poverty, but 34.8% of indigenous groups are in extreme poverty. 7.4 at national level, 34 at the indigenous groups. And if you talk about the indigenous women, then we can increase that percentage. So in order to get the people out of poverty or extreme poverty, we need proactive policies for doing it. In fact, I would dare to say of positive discrimination. The second category that is related to those who have already been out of poverty, but they are very vulnerable, then we have the resilience compound. How to ensure that an economic shock, there are some countries in Latin America that I won't say the name of them, and I'm very fond of them, that have taken a lot of people from out of poverty in the last 30 years, but now they have gone back, and you can see the numbers. How to ensure that those who have left poverty do not go back to poverty. And policies are different. We are not talking about positive discrimination. We are talking of things such as tellers or ATMs, or to ensure that the people have social security. The thing of formality in the employment sector. I think more than a half of employees live, I think 60% almost live in informal employment. And what does that mean? That they don't have the health insurance and many other insurances. So maybe they have moved from poverty, but day by day are fighting and suffering and expecting not to go back to poverty. So we need to do that distinction between getting the people out of poverty, the high-hanging fruits, Ya lo hemos hecho muy bien con estos high-hanging fruits. Es de high-hanging fruits que son los más difíciles. Y eso, and that is in the case in Latin America. I'm not very familiar with Indonesia. I think Indonesia, what they need to do is to stop smoking, and that's it. And then you will be okay. But in Mexico, it's not the case precisely. But the high-hanging fruits in Latin America, those groups that are more vulnerable, and we need to provide an emphasis to those. Thank you very much for such interesting comments from Antonio. And then I would like to ask the same thing to Andi Dulung. What do you think? What are the determining factors that could help to get out of poverty beyond the region? Antonio has mentioned that somebody that has come out of poverty and how to stop them to go back to poverty. I know that there are many productive actions to do so. So I hope Indonesia can stop smoking so you don't have a lot of chronic diseases, especially in the lungs. So go ahead, please. That microphone is not working. It's not working either? No? Gracias.
I think that's interesting that the social assistance actually we give to the mother, so to the woman. So all the bank account is right down in the for the name of the mother, and because your father is not believer. So any idea actually that say that if in the family we find that they are smoking, and then we will stop the aid to this family. We also make a gift and communication. Another statement also from Antonio is good is regarding floor. That one last time we find also especially in Indonesia we call it one place that's very high for poverty, Nusa Tenggara Timur or East Nusa Tenggara, because one of the procurement for give the aid that must be the owner of the land. So the people, they must be on the land. In fact, there are so many people that doesn't have land. So how to solve this problem? And then at that time we give the policy that's okay, we just give the flooring, only floor. And then that's very good also. Besides that, I think going from the social assistance and protection, because if you see it from target SDGs to manifestation by 2030, that's one of, we have to expand also a social protection program targeting appropriate scheme, and beside the disaster risk reduction also we have to introduce. There are many social assistance and protection programs have been implemented. You can say like CCT program, as I mentioned before, and then scholarship, food stamp, and the other thing is we just finished universal health care. We just start 2013. Saving account for elderly. If you see here, universal health coverage as a social assistance program has reached now 70% of population. So we reach now around 197 million people from 260 million our population. And 40% of the population, or around 100 million from them, or nearly 50% coverage now, paid by the government. The premium is paid by government. CCT program now also increasing the targeting, cover 17% of population, and food assistance as well for scholarship, cover 25% of population. We hope next year, another program will be to be social assistant that's gas subsidized, also will go to directly go to the account of the people. The success of this, we found that when the program targeting will be integrated in unifying database, all the program will be complemented through its own target. So, like you see in I have table here. Oh. Can we have the table, please? So, all the beneficiaries of CCT will also eligible for taking all the program because they are the poorest. So this is we tried since 2017, and then we find the result decreasing very much for the poverty rate. In terms of the disaster reduction, actually we have started 1945, then revolution, but that one is actually to relieve Indonesian national revolution. And we continue 1966, the government established Advisory Board for Central National Disaster. And currently we have advisory body, which by President Decree 2008. So now I hope this one is work well, because in 2 months, this one, every island, big island, has suffered with earthquake. Very sad. Last month is Nusa Tenggara Barat, Lombok, close to Bali, and now moved to the other island, big island, Celebes Island. To formulate establishment of disaster management policy and handling refugees to act quickly and appropriately, effectively, efficiently, coordinating, implementing disaster. Hopefully coordinating this one can be good, not as you say that. In operational, the government established Resilient Village also, and we have more than 50,000 volunteers. This approach is what we know that's community-based disaster management. So we collect from the village, volunteer in order to help if disaster occurs. So, in order to exit the poor permanently, so we had another program that's empowerment, what we call it the graduation model. So we give empowerment social and empowerment economy to the people who has already get actually social assistance, and then if the empowerment was success, then have to exit from the program, such as CCT or BPMT, that one. So all of this program now is unifying data and continuing, we increasing the quality of the data, and this is one of the become crucial about the data. And then another thing, the delivery model. The delivery system now, because in order to make easy to monitoring and opening for everyone, and we use bank account. Now we have started with the bank account because need internet, that's one. So we have to reduce much more in soon as possible the blank spot area. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Andi. Muy interesante.
Thank you very much, Andi. Quite interesting what you're saying for reducing poverty in the social protection coverage, the scholarships, and the such important thing about how to support or how to provide the support for the natural disasters and the group of volunteers that you have mentioned. I really appreciate your comments. Now we are going to ask Kesamang to tell us about what are the strategies and programs that have been implemented successfully in each of the regions that would contribute the reduction of extreme poverty in a sustainable way.
Okay, thank you. Let me start by saying, just to link with the first question, just to say that it is very, very important for us to also realize that Africa has realized that without having to open up its borders to each of the member states, we will never move the way we should be moving. So that is why it has implemented quite a number of and adopted quite a number of policies and treaties. One of them being the current one, which was adopted this year, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to open borders, and also the free movement of persons in Africa, where people will be able to move from one country to another, of course bearing in mind the rules and procedures of each member state. But it will make it easier, meaning that it will be easier now for an African to travel in Africa than an African to travel to Europe and America. So, of course, I mean, there are always controversies with just policies, but it will help also to transfer experience and expertise across Africa to ensure that there is investment. And of course, with the investment, we are expecting that poverty will be dealt with. The strategies that we have in Africa, which of course my colleagues here from South Africa and Malawi can elaborate, because they are different per country. It's unconditional cash transfers, and I want to let you know that they are picking up. There is a lot of absorption of that in each country than it was before, where there are unconditional cash transfers to address issues of aging, disability, children, as well as pregnant teenagers. And also, of course, there is in-kind transfers like agricultural subsidies. Most of our people are subsistence farmers, so they need subsidies in agriculture. Food and energy price subsidies. There are certain foodstuffs, depending on a given country, where VAT, value-added tax, as well as customs taxes are cut or totally or reduced by half or totally not applying, to ensure that people who are needy people are able to access them. Also, school feeding programs. They are seen across the continent, and this encourages children to go to school and to be able to have a nutritious meal, meaning that we'll have more children educated and be able to break the cycle of poverty. There are public works, one of course, which is, I want just to quote because they are here, is the South Africa's expanded public works program. The colleagues are here, so during lunch hour, just interact with them. They'll give you more information. There's a lot of public works, depending on each country, go across Africa. So there are many, many of those interventions, but all of them are geared towards eradicating poverty. And I want also to mention that there are more countries coming on board using their own national resources to fund this. Because in the past, a lot of them, sometimes 100%, they were funded through donor funding, which of course is a very big disadvantage. Because I mean, if the donors get tired and they really are not interested, the program or the strategy just collapses. But we are seeing more countries, even just small countries with very small or limited economic muscles, they are showing interest in doing that because it is a human right. It's no longer just a social. It's no longer just a social welfare issue. It's a human right issue, and human right is now, of course, getting recognition within the continent due to some of the positions and strategies that the African Union has taken, like ensuring that there is democracy, there is good governance, there is rule of law, and all those now are making most of the African countries to realize that for Africa to advance and to go forward and to ensure that nothing is done without us and no one is left behind. And this is the Africa we want to have come 2063. They are now adopting the culture of human rights, good governance, democracy, and elections. Of course, I mean, elections doesn't mean that there shall be democracy and good governance. But at least if there is an election, you have given people an opportunity to choose either the best or the worst of rulers, and they would have to keep up with him or her during the duration the person will be there. So in short, there are a plethora of strategies. These are just a few that I mentioned. But the details are with my colleagues, which are just seated amongst you there, because even when you talk of a cash transfer, it differs from one member state to another, because they are addressing different issues the way they see them. So, in a nutshell, these are the success stories that you see in Africa among the 55 member states. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, muy interesante ver que entre los mismos países haya esta coordinación que nos menciona con estos ejemplos.
Examples, I think that is something that we should be looking at, that everyone should be looking at for the future. And finally, I would ask also, Christina, what strategies and programs you consider that have been successfully implemented in each region in order to really reduce poverty in a sustained manner?
Representing one single region, let me just respond by giving some examples from German Development Cooperation and experiences from different regions. Maybe I'll start with some of the countries that are actually here today. So one of the examples I was going to mention is the Indonesian social health protection system. Luckily you already did, so I can cut this short, but I just wanted to say that Germany supported Indonesia in the introduction of a national health insurance provider, also contributing to building a social health protection system that is, among the biggest ones in the world. And a similar engagement is also still ongoing in India as well right now with GIZ support. But also social assistance forms part of, and it is an integral part of social protection systems. In Cambodia, we've been working with the government to adopt a standardized and universally recognized procedure called ID Poor, to identify poor households and that are in need of assistance, and also continue to work with the government on a new social protection strategy, which is supposed to combine the social assistance part with the social insurance part of the system, which have been traditionally with different ministries in the country. And to go one step further, we're also closely working with the government of Malawi, and we have a few representatives here today as well, to harmonize the 5 key social protection programs in the country, and that includes social assistance, so cash transfers, school feeding, village savings, and microcredit as well, but also employment promotion, so public works. And amongst others, this includes a harmonized M&E system for social protection, but also a creation of a single registry, and that is quite crucial, as I mentioned before, to contain information on at least 50% of the population in each district. That is the goal right now, but obviously, ideally, to be expanded more in the future. And this system, this single registry, can then be used by different programs to identify beneficiaries. So all of these components form part of a system that is needed to implement universal social protection. And to bring all of these different pieces together and also to advance the cause for universal social protection globally, German Development Cooperation is also supporting global exchange and learning events like this one. And last year there was also an event jointly organized with Mexico precisely on the challenges regarding the implementation and the monitoring of the SDGs in national social protection systems and how to improve coordination among different stakeholders. And so now we also hope to take this exchange further as part of the Universal Social Protection USP 2030 initiative with champions of the Global South, many of whom are present here today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Cristina,
for these examples that you have mentioned about countries such as this part of social protection specifically has covered regarding health. I would just like to make a small commercial for my professional training in the health sector, where in Mexico we have health protection 14 years back, which is the popular insurance which covers health, since we're talking about 55 million people that don't have Social Security and that they have now. And this was achieved by modifying legislation, but it was mostly modified by means of a change in the formula of the delivery of health services, where like Dr. Julio Franklin, who established the popular insurance, let the money follow people. So there's a formula in order for resources to come to the number of people which are covered by each of the entities. I think this improved, having a funding or a funding that was not available in the past in order to have health coverage by means of the popular insurance, and this was given to people that don't have Social Security. And it's changing because Social Security is, as you say, that depends on having a formal employment or formal jobs done. And it's worthwhile saying this. I hope that the popular insurance will not disappear, because it's been really a highly significant change as far as health coverage is concerned for people with who are in the low income brackets in our country. I don't know if anybody would like to make a comment, or someone from our audience would like to ask a question. We may have a few minutes maybe, or a question. Yes, Assistant Minister. Thanks. Now, this issue is something that we have discussed with Antonio, but yesterday and Tuesday, when we were talking, in the different tables we were holding conversations, it's clear that there's a culture and a sort of an alignment to the 2030 agenda, and all the countries are trying to build starting from there. But something that we keep asking is, what's the starting point if all of us have different measurements, all of us use different indicators? So here in CONADIS it says 53 million poor, but according to CEPAL it's 20 million people, and if it's OECD there's 18 million. So we have a problem in the measurement system. So what's the starting point? Because if the objective is universal, we should also make sure for references to be as much as possible, because so we could find definitions and thresholds that might help, that might be of help, so that just out of for mere corporation's sake, benchmarks are important. And so one could say, well, I managed to overcome poverty by 30%. Yeah, but I don't know what you measured and how you did it, and I don't know if that's compatible. I think this is one of the essential subjects there, essential issues. I don't know how the United Nations agencies are planning to establish some sort of an approximation, because I think that a time will come in the measure that there's greater pressure you know, regarding programs and budgets, because to what Paulina says, because when you take this to the field, progress has to be made, and you have to report this progress. And in order to report what progress you've made, you have to measure it. I don't know if you could comment on this. Well, Antonio, this is a personal allusion. No, the assistant minister wishes to provoke me. Esa es toda una pregunta. Eh? I think this is one of the great challenges for the international community. We're talking about the same numbers, and I know that whenever the United Nations Development Program puts out its Human Development Index, and it's just put it out, it's just released it, the intents were very good, you know, looking for a human development index and have us to set up a sort of a ranking. So this is turned out to give a super complicated system. The numbers used by the UN come from the very member states, from their statistical offices, their statistics office, and you know, not everything has the same quality. So there are countries, for example, that are above other countries that shouldn't be there, and there are complaints and scandals, and yeah, and with full reason. I think this is a big subject. How to standardize data? Because at the end of the day, if we wish to comply with this, we'll have all the objectives and all the information available. And well, if you give me a tip, you know, this will be here. But if you want to comply with this, we need to have data. We need a reliable statistical base. And this goes to the question by the assistant minister. We need a statistical base, not only a reliable statistical base, but also a methodology that will be standard, you know. And I think that this is about going to multi-dimensional poverty, and Mexico is one of the first countries in adopting that methodology. Well, I think they're positive. I think that in time countries will follow that direction. It's a way to measure poverty, not only in terms of income. It incorporates some other very important, significant bases. So this is something that the various countries have to take up, you know. I agree with the assistant minister that we need to have a sort of standardization. You know, the figures, we need to standardize figures, otherwise public policies will not be effective. I know I didn't answer your question, but yeah, that's all you're gonna get, you know. Now I don't know if the question has been answered or he left you worse off, but if anybody else wishes to dwell on the matter, on this question or any other question that you might like to ask from our panel members. Thanks for, well, a bit as a follow-up regarding the concerns shown by the assistant minister, we've kind of followed up these ODSs in different forums, and generally it's the other way around. You know, it seems that it's a virtue having or acknowledging the differences among countries. So the degree of development of the countries, we say simply, it's something that will allow us to improve in relative terms, but in an optimal fashion. Every citizen of the world should have their own rights in that regard. Then what the assistant minister says takes a lot of meaning in order to have a standard measurement, but the circumstances in which the various countries find themselves, I think it's a virtue, you know, respecting the national indicators and the differences amongst countries. Yes, look, the fact that there's somebody from Africa, okay, someone from Latin America, someone from Europe, and someone from Asia, talking about the 2030 agenda and these objectives, that's, and I can assure you that this conversation is being listened to in all the countries. In Sweden, they have set up the Ministry of Sustainable Development Objectives. There's a ministry. I have a son studying in Canada, in the university, and one of the subjects is this sustainable development. This conversation we're holding here is being duplicated all over the world. Every country is different, but there are objectives here that cannot be left for just one country. For example, issue of the 13th that has to do with global warming. That's not just simply to say, well, I'll leave it in my country. No, all countries have to work. We have been talking about this subject is something that is really of great interest for me. You go to Quintana Roo, go to a Quintana Roo beach, to one of the beaches, and these beaches are suffering due to this algae called sargassum. Those that don't know what sargassum is, these are algae from other continents. Yeah, seaweed. Yeah, that's seaweed. Okay, there's seaweed. This is a problem that does not concern Mexico alone or for the Dominican Republic. It's a problem of the whole world, and it's part of this. And it can't be solved. It has to be solved by all countries because it's impacting Mexico in a very serious manner. We're talking about plastics and many other issues which are here. But then we can talk about very country-specific issues, but at the end of the day, this is going to be solved jointly by the international community. Did you want to take the word, Paulina? Just thinking about, we were asked by the assistant minister, and that we have faced all these years. And this seaweed is very important, but it's something that we measure. Yes, in 2014, we didn't have the indicator, and that's a problem. We're going to do something that we've never done by measuring what we have always measured, and we've been, fighting, because to have the infant mortality go down and the mortality of mothers as well. And when I read about the strategy, hey, you're just going to talk about coverage to me, then. No, talk about coverage. No, let's talk about coverage, but then quality as well. So this question about indicators, and every indicator is a world by itself. Then we have the global indicators, and Mexico complies with indicators, and we have we work with CONADIS. We work with institutions that for years have devoted themselves to that, and at the same time we think again about indicators and about actions, and maybe all indicators. It's just about diagnostic or forecast. If we want to see the progress made in public policies, we still need indicators. And this is something that we've discussed with many of you. How do we do in order to measure how we're doing, and if what we're doing works? If we measure many times about, with population, then really this gives enough for PhD and for hours and hours of discussion. But the issue is no less of what we measure and how we measure, because we want to measure and see whether we're doing good or bad. But we can't measure what we have always measured if we want to do what we've never done. It's not easy. I think that this is, led to more doubts instead of answering things. Well, I don't know if anybody else wishes to ask a question. Excuse me. No, the last one, says Antonio. Okay, good afternoon. It's a question for the panel in general. In a small recount, in 2016 there was an article in the New York Times that said that the article was called "The Best News is that you give." 20 years ago, the poverty rate was 40%, and nobody cared about that. The poor were 40% of the world's population. How can we change that mindset? It's not that poverty can be eliminated tomorrow, and that. But how can we make people that see that we have made this progress? How can we make them be acknowledged then and well known? How can be made known? Measurement by the World Bank: less than 7% of the population is in extreme poverty. But CONADIS says that it's double or 3 times that. And people, when you talk to them, they think that even reaches 80% of the population. So how can we start to? This is going to sound vulgar. How can we sell the good information or the positive information? How can we sell positive information? Make it known. Well, I make these presentations of the 2030 agenda all over the country, and I always bring good news. yesterday I talked about something that people don't know about, or that they didn't know about, and it's ozone. Some who are here may remember that 30 years ago, it said that the ozone layer was disappearing and that all of us would die. It was an issue in the mass media. It was ozone, you know. And the international community was told about this. And with the private sector, the Montreal Protocol took place as a terrific city, but the Montreal Protocol was adopted, and with the private sector, we eliminated the hydrofluorocarbons that we have in our fridges, and so the ozone was eliminated, and the Argentinians that wanted to go to Punta del Este, and they were afraid not to have any skin cancer, okay? And that was solved, okay? And that's good news. Now, the progress of mankind since the year, from the year 2000 to 2015 in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, poverty reduction, education for girls in the sub-Saharan continent, the level of education of young girls, the progress made has been fantastic. There has never been such progress in mankind in terms of those indicators from the year 2000 to 2015. That's why I'm convinced that this is something good, because this is dealing with other issues from now until 2030 and being able to solve those subjects. And the same happens with climate change, more democracy, and it was mentioned here. Well, if there is no further question or comment, I want to thank all the panel members for their participation, the interesting experiences that you've had in your countries as well as in the region. And I want to thank you. Oh, excuse me. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que algo que se aprende de México.
When you change from income indicator to be multi-criteria, because it must be increase, and then how to defend with in terms of political with the public. Thanks. I think that's okay. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Muy bien. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos y a ustedes por su presencia.
Thanks for your presence and your attendance and your attention. Now we invite you to have a coffee and refreshments. We have 15 minutes break.